On Monday, 12th of January 2026, I unlocked my chamber at Belhaven Municipal Court on 214 East Polk Street at 6:18 in the morning. Rain tapped the old stone like patient fingers, and the kind of January cold that settles in your knees had already made the hall smell faintly of wet wool and floor polish. I poured black coffee from the dented thermos I have used for 12 years, set my father's silver letter opener beside the day's docket, and looked out at a parking lot still half dark under the courthouse lamps. I have always come in before everyone else. My father, who practiced law until his hands shook too hard to button his cuffs, used to tell me that if a judge wants to ask people for truth, she ought to meet the morning before the lies do. He also told me rules without heart become weapons, and that the courtroom is the last place on earth where every single person must be treated equal, even when one walks in wearing a Rolex and the other walks in wearing shoes held together by hope. At 6:31, my clerk, Denise Harper, came in carrying the first stack of files and a paper cup of tea with too much honey. Denise had worked beside me for 14 years, and she could usually read the weather in my face before I spoke. She set the file on my desk and said, "Morning, Judge. Captain Halbrook is already downstairs with counsel." Then she paused and added, "And Ms. Vega is here too. She came alone." I remember the way she said alone, soft and flat, like a fact that should not matter but did. Have you ever felt a day tilt before anything even happened? The way a room can warn you before a word is spoken? I am asking because that is how it felt when Denise said those names. One person arrived with a lawyer before sunrise. One person arrived alone. Before court even opened, justice had already been asked a question. At 8:57, Bailiff Sergeant Leon Pike opened the courtroom doors, and the low murmur of waiting people rolled in with the wet air. Belhaven's municipal courtroom is not grand. The wood is nicked, the microphone hums if you breathe on it wrong, and the old vent near the jury rail sighs like a tired man. But I have always believed dignity does not depend on marble. It depends on whether the people inside a room mean what they say. That morning, every bench was filled. Word had traveled fast that a city police captain was due in front of me on charges that began as a traffic matter and had turned into something much darker. Captain Roman Vance Halbrook entered first at 8:59, 45 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, groomed down to the smallest detail. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that fit him like it had been measured onto his body, a white shirt open at the collar, an Hermes belt, and a steel Rolex Daytona bright enough to catch the lights each time he moved his hand. He carried a Louis Vuitton document case and the kind of smile rich men wear when they think every room is just another lobby built for them. Even out of uniform, Roman Halbrook looked like a man who expected strangers to part for him. Marisol Elena Vega entered behind the prosecutor 1 minute later, and if you had blinked, you might have missed the whole difference between them. She was 41, slight in the shoulders, with dark hair pulled into a low knot and hospital tiredness still living under her eyes. She wore a clean navy cardigan over a pale gray blouse, black slacks, sensible shoes, and the same silver cross necklace she later told us she had worn since she was 19. She held a worn vinyl purse against her side with both hands. The left wrist brace under her sleeve showed only when she reached for the chair. "Stay right here with me and test something I learned a long time ago. Watch what happens when rank walks in certain it owns the floor, and quiet endurance walks in with nothing but the truth." I already knew one of them had practiced his face in mirrors. The other one had practiced surviving. When Denise called the case, her voice cut through the room with the clean sound of routine. City of Belhaven versus Roman Vance Halbrook, case number 25, TRC 1184, and related misdemeanor complaints 25 CRB 441 through 444. Roman did not look at her. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one polished shoe over the other, and whispered something to his lawyer, Calvin Sloan, that made the man smile into his tie. Marisol sat very still, her eyes on me, not pleading, not performing, just waiting to see whether the law would look back at her as if she existed. The charges before me were leaving the scene of a property damage accident, reckless operation of a motor vehicle, criminal damaging, obstructing official business, and a later added count of intimidation of a crime victim. The added count mattered. It had not been part of the case at arraignment on Monday, 20th October 2025, when Roman first stood before me and entered not guilty pleas with his chin raised and his hands clasped behind him like he was inspecting the place. That count came after weeks of things surfacing that should never have happened in a city that asks ordinary people to trust a badge. The original incident took place on Friday, 17th October 2025 at 10:47 p.m. in the parking lot of Westgate Pharmacy and Market at 800 Larkin Avenue in Belhaven. Officer Tessa Grady, badge number 417, was first on scene at 10:56 p.m. Officer Miguel Santos, badge number 233, arrived 40 seconds later. According to the first report, a black 2024 Porsche Panamera Turbo S, Ohio plate HV7719, struck a parked silver 2011 Honda CR-V, caused visible damage to the driver's side door and rear quarter panel, and left before officers arrived. The owner of that Honda was Marisol Vega. I asked the prosecutor, Angela Price, to begin with the facts, and she did what good prosecutors do when they know they have to earn every inch in a room full of suspicion. She walked us through the night as if laying stones across water. Ms. Vega had clocked out from St. Agnes Medical Center at 10:15 p.m. after a 12-hour emergency department shift. She stopped at Westgate to pick up her father's phosphate binder prescription, eggs, cereal, cough medicine for her son Daniel, and poster board for Daniel's school project due the next morning. She had $83.14 in her checking account that night. The estimate to fix her car would later come back at $6,842.19. Now let me ask you for your patience, because a case does not become heavy all at once. It gains weight one ordinary detail at a time. A grocery bag, a wrist brace, a child's school poster in the back seat. Keep listening, because the missing piece was already in that parking lot, and by noon it would change the air in the whole room. Marisol testified before 10 Marg that morning, and she spoke the way some people pray, careful not to waste a word. She explained that she had worked 17 years in the St. Agnes Emergency Department, mostly nights, mostly weekends, because night shift paid $1.75 more an hour and because it let her be home when her children got out of school. Sofia Vega was 14. Daniel Vega was 9. Her father, Rafael Vega, 72, lived in the small back bedroom of their duplex on Juniper Terrace and went to dialysis 3 times a week after complications from diabetes cost him part of his left foot. When Ms. Price asked about money, Marisol did not dramatize. She said, "I paid what I could when I could." She had bought the 2011 Honda CR-V 3 years earlier with 204 miles on it because it was what she could afford after her husband died of a sudden stroke at 39. She still owed $2,900 on the title loan. Her son Daniel wore one hearing aid in his right ear after a childhood infection. Sophia had started doing homework at the kitchen table while helping monitor her grandfather's glucose because, as Marisol put it, "We all do our part in my house." At 10:47 p.m. on that Friday night, Marisol wheeled her cart toward her Honda. The parking lot was wet. The pharmacy sign buzzed blue over the pavement. She had just opened the rear passenger door and set the poster board inside when she heard an engine surge in the fire lane behind her. She turned. The black Porsche was coming too fast for a lot with painted arrows and shopping carts. She guessed 20 miles an hour. Officer Grady later estimated between 18 and 22. The Porsche clipped the metal cart, slammed into the Honda's driver's side, and shoved the car 6 inches sideways. The room stayed quiet when Marisol described the eggs breaking under her shoes. It stayed quieter when she said the insulated medicine bag hit the asphalt and burst open. Her left wrist twisted as she tried to catch herself on the doorframe. Then the driver stepped out. "He looked angry that I existed," she said. Roman Halbrook stared at the table when she said that. Marisol told us he smelled like bourbon and expensive cologne. She told us he looked down at her dented car and said, "Take a picture if you want. I'm Captain Halbrook. You can't touch me." If you know what it feels like to be spoken to as if your pain is an inconvenience, hold that feeling for a second. That is where this story stopped being about a bumper in a parking lot. That is where it became about whether dignity still has standing when money, rank, and contempt walk in together. Ms. Price asked Marisol what she said back. Marisol folded her hands and answered the way she had all morning, plain and precise. I told him my father needed that medicine and I needed his insurance. She said Roman looked at the rust near her wheel well, laughed once through his nose and replied, that thing was dying anyway. Then, according to her testimony, he raised a black leather badge wallet just long enough for her to see the gold shield, got back into his Porsche, put his phone on speaker, and said to someone, handle Larkin for me, before driving off. The defense objected to that last sentence, and I let Ms. Price lay foundation before moving on. That is the part the public often does not understand. A courtroom is not built from feelings alone, no matter how strong they are. My father used to say, if you want truth to survive appeal, teach it to walk on evidence. So we moved carefully. Ms. Price called Kiana Brooks, age 19, a second-year nursing student at Belhaven Community College, who had been standing under the store awning waiting for her brother to pick her up. Kiana wore a tan coat with one missing button and looked terrified until I told her to take a breath and speak to me, not to the man at the defense table. She told us she saw the Porsche cut through the fire lane without stopping at the painted crosswalk. She heard the impact. She saw groceries spill. She also heard the driver say, "You can't touch me," in a tone she described as almost bored. Kiana dialed 911 at 10:49 p.m. The call log confirmed it. She stayed with Marisol until Officer Grady arrived and wrapped a clean towel from the store around the medicine bag. Then came the part that had kept needling at me since the arraignment. Ms. Price asked Kiana whether she saw a camera in Ms. Vega's Honda. Kiana said yes, a small black dash camera mounted behind the rearview mirror, blinking blue before the crash. But when the Honda was later released from impound, the memory card was gone. I remember Roman moving for the first time when that came out. Not much, just 2 fingers tightening against the Louis Vuitton handle. It was a tiny thing, but I had been watching Liars for 28 years. Tiny things have a language all their own. You may already think you know where this is going, but stay with me anyway, because the question was no longer just who hit whom in a wet parking lot. The real question had become this: who touched that car after midnight, and why was a police captain so calm about a missing card that should have buried him? On Monday, 20th of October 2025, at the arraignment, Roman Halbrook had stood before me as if the whole business were an administrative error. He had arrived in a camel overcoat over that same hard confidence with a different watch, a Patek Philippe this time, and told me through counsel that he looked forward to dispelling confusion. When I set bond conditions and a no-contact order, Roman smirked at the floor. When I explained that no rank placed any defendant above my authority, he said out loud, "Of course, Your Honor," but the look he gave me afterwards said the sentence had never entered him at all. By the time we reached trial on 12th January, everyone in that room knew the case had grown teeth. Still, Roman sat there with his ankle over his knee, rolling his pen between 2 fingers and looking at people the way men look at valet parking attendants when the car takes too long. Marisol never once leaned back in her chair. She sat upright through every witness, sometimes pressing the thumb of her right hand into her left palm where the brace ended, as if pain had become an old habit she no longer bothered to announce. If you are one of those people who still believe small courtrooms matter, then stay close to me here. Cases like this are where a city finds out what it truly worships, not in speeches, not in campaigns, but in whether an ordinary woman gets the same law a captain thinks belongs only to him. Acting with more confidence than good sense, Roman made himself impossible to ignore before the lunch recess ever came. He sighed loudly through testimony. He laughed once when Harold Pruitt, the 63-year-old Westgate night manager, struggled to adjust the microphone with his arthritic fingers. He leaned over to his lawyer while Officer Grady described the scrape pattern on the Honda and said, not quietly enough, "This is what happens when people turn parking lots into class action lawsuits." Several people in the gallery heard him. So did I. I stopped the testimony, looked directly at him, and said, "Captain Halbrook, you are a defendant in a court of law, not a commentator at your own show." Harold Pruitt testified next. He had worked nights at Westgate for 11 years, and his tie was crooked in the way ties get when a man has put them on in the dark. Harold identified the store surveillance stills taken at 10:47:13 p.m., 10:47:17 p.m., and 10:47:24 p.m. The footage did not catch the full impact, but it showed the black Porsche entering the fire lane at speed, the metal cart jerking sideways, and the rear of the Honda bouncing once from the hit. Harold also identified Roman in the stills by the white shirt, open collar, and the bright face of his watch as he stepped out. Then Ms. Price introduced State's Exhibit 12, the repair estimate for Marisol's Honda, and State's Exhibit 13, photographs taken by Officer Grady. I have seen photographs of damage all my adult life. Bent metal rarely speaks by itself, but those photographs did. The driver's side door of the Honda was folded in around the seam like a crushed can. Black paint from the Porsche streaked through the silver. On the pavement beside the rear tire sat a split carton of eggs, a rain-soaked box of children's cough medicine, and the torn insulated medicine bag with Rafael Vega's prescription label still readable under plastic. Officer Tessa Grady, badge 417, carried herself with the clean steadiness I wish every young officer learned before they put on a uniform. She testified that Marisol was cooperative, visibly shaken, and trying harder to protect the medicine than to complain about herself. Grady noted swelling to Marisol's left wrist and a fresh bruise at the heel of her palm. She also testified that when she contacted South Precinct to identify the Porsche plate, the dispatcher went silent for what she estimated was 8 to 10 seconds before coming back and saying only, "Supervisor will advise." That pause mattered more than some people in the room understood. Think for a moment about the last time somebody with money or status tried to make you feel smaller than you are. Most people remember the words. I have learned we also remember the pause after the words. The pause where everyone nearby decides whether truth is worth the trouble. That morning, Officer Grady had chosen the trouble. Officer Miguel Santos, badge 233, followed her and confirmed the basics. He documented the scene, measured the skidless impact zone, and recovered a fragment of black headlamp trim consistent with a Porsche Panamera. He also noticed, as Grady had, the dash camera mounted behind Marisol's mirror. When Ms. Price asked whether the camera was still there when the Honda left impound 48 hours later, Santos answered, "Camera housing, yes. Card, no." Roman looked at the ceiling after that, the way people do when they want to look anywhere that is not truth. On cross-examination, Calvin Sloan tried to suggest Marisol had exaggerated the speed and that a tired night shift nurse could easily mistake a hurried driver for a reckless one. Officer Grady did not flinch. She said, "The speed estimate came from vehicle displacement, cart travel, and damage pattern, not from sympathy." That line drew the first murmur from the gallery, and Leon Pike took one step forward near the rail without ever taking his hand off the belt clasp at his waist. Courtrooms have their own weather. That morning I could feel pressure building. Kiana Brooks came back for brief redirect and added one detail she had not forgotten. She said after Roman got back into the Porsche, he had lowered the window halfway and looked at Marisol one last time. Kiana's voice shook when she repeated the words. He said, "People like you always want a payout." Marisol did not react. That is what struck me. A person performing would have cried then. She only lowered her eyes to the tabletop and pressed her lips together like someone used to swallowing what should never have been said. The first documentary piece that truly hurt Roman came right before noon. Ms. Price introduced City Exhibit 21, the impound authorization form for the Honda, signed electronically at 12:14 a.m. on 18th October 2025 by South Precinct Watch Command. Then she introduced City Exhibit 22, the towing request log showing the vehicle had been moved not to collision processing, but to a fenced lot on Bay Street normally used for abandoned cars. No warrant, no reconstruction request, no formal evidence inventory, just a hold. Officer Grady testified she had never asked for that hold and did not know it existed until 2 days later. If there is a nurse in your life or any person who works while the rest of the city sleeps and still gets treated like they are disposable, send this story to them when it is over. I mean that. People who carry the weak on their backs should not have to beg a court to notice when someone powerful steps on their hands. By 12:07 p.m., Roman's easy smile had thinned into irritation. He whispered to Calvin Sloan more often now. Ms. Price called the record's custodian from South Precinct, a pale young sergeant named Erin Weller, who looked like she wished the floor would open. Sergeant Weller confirmed the impound request had originated from the login credentials of Captain Roman Hallbrook's administrative account at 11:58 p.m. on the night of the crash. The defense objected before she could finish. I overruled. The jury benches, though empty of any formal jury, seemed to lean forward all at once. Then came Alyssa Kern, 31 years old, freelance public relations contractor for the Harbor Light Police Foundation Gala, held that same night at the Dominion Hotel downtown. Alyssa had known Roman for nearly 2 years through charity events and social media promotion. She wore a dark green blazer, spoke clearly, and looked right at him when she was sworn. Ms. Price asked whether she followed Roman Hallbrook on Instagram. Alyssa answered yes. Asked whether she had received or viewed content from his account on the night of 17th of October 2025. Another yes. Roman finally sat up straight. Calvin Sloan objected again and again, throwing out words like relevance and unfair prejudice as though repeating them might turn lead into feathers. But what the defense wanted kept out was not noise. It was character, motive, timing, and consciousness of guilt all tied together with a digital knot. I allowed the testimony after foundation on account ownership date and preservation. Alyssa said she had screen-recorded Roman's close friend's Instagram story at 11:32 p.m. because it disturbed her. The timestamp was visible in the file metadata. The room turned colder for reasons that had nothing to do with January. Before Ms. Price published the video, Calvin Sloan stood and asked for a sidebar. We took it. He argued that people speak loosely on social media, that private stories are not sworn testimony, that wealthy men are targets, and that my court should not become a theater for petty online behavior. I told him social media is often where people brag without the caution they use under oath, and if his client had chosen to narrate his own soul at 11:32 p.m., that was not the court's fault. Roman heard enough of that ruling to know he was losing ground. He drummed his fingers once and stopped. Tell me honestly, because I would want to know. At what point would your trust have cracked if you were sitting where Marisol sat that day? Would it have been the missing memory card, the impound hold, or the cold ease on that man's face when his own private words were about to be played out loud to people he thought beneath him? The screen in our courtroom is small and older than it should be, but I can still see that video in my mind with awful clarity. It was 7 seconds long, shot from inside the black Porsche. Roman's left hand was on the wheel, the Rolex bright at the wrist, the red dashboard lights throwing a low glow across the Tom Ford cuff. Through the windshield, you could see the blue Westgate sign, and in the background, the damaged silver Honda. The caption across the bottom read, "One more parking lot scrub begging for a payout. Rank outruns receipts." No one breathed for a second after the clip ended. Then the room let out its breath all at once, a sound not quite a gasp and not quite a groan. Marisol did not look up. Harold Pruitt stared at the screen as if it had insulted his whole generation. Denise Harper's pen stopped over the docket. Even Leon Pike, who had stood beside me through bomb threats, custody fights, and one winter morning when a man tried to climb the rail with a screwdriver in his sock, went still. Roman did not. He leaned back and gave one small shrug, as if the whole thing proved nothing except that private jokes sometimes escaped the room they belonged in. Calvin Sloan rose fast and said the clip was ugly but meaningless, that people perform online, that a vain caption was not proof of a crime. Ms. Price answered before the echo of his last word had died. She said, "It is not the vanity that matters. It is the timing, the location, the vehicle interior, and the contempt." Then she turned back to Alyssa Kern and asked if she had messaged Roman after seeing the story. Alyssa swallowed, nodded, and told us she had replied at 11:35 p.m. with 4 words. "Did you really hit her?" Roman answered at 11:36 p.m. She had preserved that too. The message read, "Relax, it's handled." When Ms. Price read those words aloud, a man in the back row let out a breath so sharp it almost sounded like a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it. Roman's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the wall clock above the exit. Then Ms. Price called Jordan Lemke, 38 years old, digital forensic analyst for the Bell County Prosecutor's Office. Mr. Lemke was narrow, pale, careful, the kind of witness who looked like he would apologize before knocking on a door. He authenticated the screen recording, the metadata, the account ownership, and Roman's device linkage. The upload source was Roman's iPhone 15 Pro Max. The timestamp was 11:32:14 p.m. The location tag data, though not publicly visible in the story, placed the phone within 30 meters of Westgate Pharmacy. What changed the mood even more was not the data itself. It was the way Jordan spoke. Slow, exact, no heat. That is often how truth sounds when it knows it can stand on its own feet. Ms. Price asked whether the story had later been deleted. Jordan said yes, manually, at 12:03 a.m. on 18th October 2025. Then she asked whether the phone showed outgoing calls between the post and the deletion. Yes, again. At 11:38 p.m., Roman called Lieutenant Wade Marin for 1 minute and 12 seconds. If what is happening here is getting under your skin, let it. Look back for a second at the last time somebody with power treated damage like a joke just because it did not happen to them. If you believe even one careless sentence can tell you who a person really is, stay with me, because the next piece is where the mask began to split for good. We broke for lunch at 12:31 p.m., but no one moved quickly. The room had that heavy courtroom silence that is different from ordinary silence. You can hear papers sliding, a shoe scraping wood, a cough that somebody tried to swallow. I sat alone in chambers with a fresh cup of black coffee gone cold before I touched it. Through the wall, I could hear the low roll of voices in the hallway, the city talking to itself about a captain whose confidence was draining in public. I thought of my father then, the way I always did when a case stopped being only about the statute line and started asking a moral question too. He used to say the law cannot make men decent, but it can stop indecent men from using the rules as clubs. I had seen plenty of people break small laws. What I could not abide, not after all those years, was a person trusted with public power turning the machinery of justice into a private shield. At 1:14 p.m. we resumed. Roman came back looking flatter around the eyes, though he had straightened his collar and smoothed his hair as if order on the surface might still save him. Marisol came back with the same careful stillness, carrying a paper cup of vending machine tea and a folded napkin in her lap. Denise called the room to order. Leon closed the doors. The vent sighed. The old microphone hummed once and settled. Ms. Price called Terrence Bell, 57, night security supervisor for Bay Street Municipal Impound. Terrence wore a Brown County jacket with the zipper half stuck and carried himself like a man who had worked too many winters in chain-link lots. He testified that at 12:41 a.m. on 18th October, an unmarked gray city Chevrolet Tahoe entered Bay Street through the employee gate. At 12:43 a.m., two men used access credentials to reach the fenced hold section where Marisol's Honda had been parked. Terrence identified one of those men in court, Roman Hallbrook. He identified the second from photo lineup and by prior acquaintance as Lieutenant Wade Marin, age 49, Roman's longtime friend and South Precinct watch commander that night. Terrence said Roman wore a dark overcoat over his dress clothes, no hat, and looked angry. He said Wade Marin carried blue nitrile gloves and a flashlight. The two men remained with the Honda for 5 to 6 minutes. When they left, Roman was holding a tiny black square between his fingers. The defense stood up so hard his chair barked against the floor. Objection, speculation, unreliable observation. I overruled as to what Terrence personally saw. Ms. Price moved in the security stills. Grainy, yes, but clear enough. Roman beside the driver's side door of the Honda, Marin leaning in through the windshield. Timestamp, 12:44:26 a.m. Another still at 12:45:11 showed Roman's right hand raised near his chest, a small dark object pinched there. No one had to be told what it likely was. I want you to sit with that image, not because it is dramatic, but because it is plain. A public servant in an impound lot after midnight, using access he had no right to use, touching evidence tied to his own case. If you have ever wondered whether arrogance can make a person stupid, this is your answer. Jordan Lemke returned to lay more foundation. The city Tahoe's GPS showed entry at Bay Street at 12:41:09 and exit at 12:49:02. Roman's key fob credential from South Precinct had unlocked the Tahoe at 12:28 a.m. Ms. Price then introduced phone extraction records obtained by subpoena. At 11:58 p.m., Roman texted Wade Marin, "Put Vega vehicle on hold." At 12:06 a.m., Marin replied, "Done." At 12:11 a.m., Roman wrote, "Need the card." When that line was read into the microphone, the air in that room seemed to pull inward. Calvin Sloan moved for dismissal on the spot, arguing the texts lacked context, that card could refer to insurance. Ms. Price answered that no one drives to an impound lot at 12:41 in the morning for an insurance card when they have already left the scene and deleted an Instagram story bragging about rank. I denied the motion to dismiss. The chain was no longer a loose set of links. It was closing. Then Roman made the mistake proud men make when they feel the wall against their back. He stood without being called, turned half toward me and said, "This is municipal court, not the Supreme Court. You handle barking dogs and parking tickets. You don't get to posture like the guardian of civilization." Denise froze mid-note. Leon Pike took one step forward. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman whispered, "Lord," I let the silence hold him for a full 2 seconds. Then I said very quietly, "Captain Holbrook, sit down now before you learn the meaning of contempt in a room too small for your ego." He sat, slow this time, red high in his cheeks. But he still was not sorry. That was plain. Cornered, yes. Humbled, no. And that mattered because what came next needed a defendant who could still look at harm and call it theater. What came after that is the part I still think about when I wake before dawn. So I need you to stay close now. The case had already become ugly, but ugly was not the end of it. The next door that opened did not lead to a worse traffic file. It led to something rotten inside the bones of power itself. At 2:03 p.m., just as Ms. Price was preparing to call her next witness, Denise approached the bench with a note. Her face had gone pale in a way I had seen only a handful of times in 14 years. Written in her neat blue ink were 6 words, "Acting Chief Pierce is here now." I looked toward the rear doors. Through the glass panel, I could already see the dark blue uniform and silver braid of Belhaven Police Acting Chief Alana Pierce. Chief Pierce entered at 2:07 p.m. in full dress uniform, cap tucked under one arm, rain still darkening the hem of her trousers. She had taken command of Belhaven Police only 3 weeks earlier after the former chief retired, and though we knew each other by work, we had never once shared so much as a casual lunch. She was not a woman given to theater. When she walked into my courtroom that afternoon, she brought 2 sealed folders, 1 flash drive, and a look on her face that told me the city was about to lose whatever innocence it had left about this case. Ms. Price asked leave to reopen her evidence for newly certified records. Calvin Sloan objected. I heard him, reviewed the certification, and granted it. Chief Pierce took the stand, was sworn, and gave her title slowly for the record. Then she told us that at 1:42 p.m. that same day she had placed Roman Holbrook, Wade Marin, and civilian evidence technician Nolan Briggs on immediate administrative suspension pending criminal investigation by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and Belhaven Professional Standards. The room shifted at that. Not loudly, not all at once, but you could feel people sit taller. Feel the gallery move from curiosity into alarm. Ms. Price asked why. Chief Pierce answered with the kind of voice people use when facts are bad enough that emotion would only make them smaller. Overnight audit of department systems had revealed an unauthorized law enforcement database search on Marisol Vega's vehicle plate at 11:07 p.m. on 17th October. Another search on her home address followed at 11:09 p.m. User credentials, Captain Roman Holbrook. Marisol looked up then. It was the first quick, unguarded movement she had made all day. Her face did not break. It tightened. That was worse. Ms. Price asked if the audit found any evidence that this information was used after the crash. Chief Pierce said yes. At 6:12 a.m. on 18th October, an unmarked South Precinct vehicle, Unit SP-14, sat across from 44 Juniper Terrace for 23 minutes. The vehicle assignment log placed Lieutenant Wade Marin behind that wheel. Neighbor camera footage confirmed the plate. This is where I need to confess something I do not often admit out loud. There are days on the bench when I can feel my anger move before I do, like heat under a locked door. I do not let it rule me. I never have. But when Chief Pierce said that a police lieutenant had sat outside a nurse's home after a captain pulled her address from the system, I felt my father's warning in my bones. Rules without heart become weapons, and someone had picked one up. Chief Pierce was not finished. At 7:26 p.m. on 18th October, Marisol Vega received a blocked voicemail on her cell phone. She had saved it because something in it chilled her. The original complaint for intimidation had been filed 3 days later on 21st October. after Officer Grady urged her not to ignore it. With foundation laid and chain of custody established, Ms. Price asked to play the voicemail in open court. I allowed it. The recording was only 9 seconds long. A man's voice, low and hurried, said, "Drop this now. Nobody at City Hall is going to wreck a captain over your junk car. Take the insurance and stay quiet." Marisol did not move. Kiana Brooks, still seated in the back after being excused, covered her mouth with both hands. Chief Pierce testified that voice comparison by state analysts was pending, but preliminary internal review identified the speaker as Nolan Briggs, evidence technician, acting after text from Wade Marin recovered that morning from a department-issued phone. Ms. Price read those texts. At 5:58 p.m., Marin to Briggs, "Call the Vega woman from Blocked." At 6:01 p.m., Briggs, "What do I say?" At 6:03 p.m., Marin, "Scare her smart." At 6:04 p.m., Briggs, "Captain wants this buried that bad?" At 6:05 p.m., Marin, "You didn't hear that from me. I watched Roman through every word. By then, the Polish had gone off him. His lips were dry. His left foot moved against the table leg over and over, small, hard taps no one in the room could miss." Then came the deeper truth, the one that changed the whole shape of the case. Chief Pierce testified that this was no longer simply a hit and run with evidence tampering. Roman had used restricted police systems before any formal contact with officers at the scene. He searched Marisol before he ever called 911 because he never intended to call 911. He intended to know exactly who she was, where she lived, and how easily she could be pressured. The moment he hit her car, he did not think about injury, insurance, or duty. He thought about control. I want to ask you something plain. Do you still believe real justice is possible when the person breaking the rules also knows where the rule book is kept? I have asked myself that more times than I can count. That afternoon in that courtroom, I was asking it again. Calvin Sloan tried to stop the bleeding by calling Roman himself. I advised the defendant of his rights in full. He chose to testify. Men like Roman often do. They believe if they can just get into the air and use their own voice, the room will remember who they are supposed to be. He took the stand at 2:58 p.m., straightened his cuffs, and looked at me as though this were one last chance for the room to come to its senses. He admitted he was driving the Porsche. He admitted there was contact with Marisol's Honda. He admitted posting the Instagram story, but every admission came wrapped in contempt. He said he had panicked due to media sensitivity. He said the story was gallows humor. He said the database search was situational awareness. He said the impound visit was an effort to preserve material in a politically charged environment. When Ms. Price asked if by material he meant the dash cam memory card, Roman answered, "I mean anything that could be edited by desperate people." That was when Marisol finally looked at him, not with hatred, not even with fear, just with that stunned sadness you feel when a person shows you there is no bottom to the hole they have dug for themselves. Ms. Price asked Roman if he knew Marisol's father was waiting on medication from the bag that split open under his car. Roman said, "I did not inventory her groceries." The gallery made a low sound then, like a storm heard from inside a house. Ms. Price asked if he knew Daniel Vega missed a hearing aid adjustment appointment on Monday, 20th of October, because the Honda was in impound and the family could not afford same-day rides across town. Roman said he had no knowledge of those family logistics. She asked if he knew Sofia Vega, age 14, had watched that unmarked police Tahoe from behind a curtain at 6:14 in the morning and thought someone had come to arrest her mother. Roman looked at the prosecutor and said, "I am not responsible for what children imagine." My blood ran cold when he said that. Not hot, cold. Because there it was, stripped of polish. The belief that harm only counts if the powerful person names it as harm. Ms. Price took one step closer and asked, "Captain Halbrook, were you ever going to report the crash?" Roman smiled, and it was the ugliest expression he wore all day. "Report it to whom?" he said. "People work for me." If you are still here, do me one small favor. Stop whatever else is in your hands or your head and really listen to the next part. Because there are moments in a courtroom when words stop being testimony and start becoming judgment long before the verdict is spoken. Chief Pierce was recalled one final time on rebuttal. She opened the second sealed folder and produced the item that changed the emotional temperature of that room from anger to something closer to grief. During the noon audit sweep, a junior evidence clerk named Monica Reeve found a crushed micro SD card in the shred bin beside Nolan Briggs's desk. The card was too damaged to recover video, but its housing matched the mount used in Marisol's dash cam. More important, tucked inside the same shred bin was a printed evidence receipt never filed into the system. The receipt was stamped 12:47 a.m., 18 October 2025. Item description: digital media card, black vehicle cam, Vega hold. Receiving initials, NB authorizing supervisor, RVH, Roman Vance Halbrook. I remember every sound that followed that reading because there were almost none. A bench creaked, the vent sighed. Somebody in the last row set down a handbag so softly it might have been setting down a glass at a funeral. Then Chief Pierce added one last fact. Roman Halbrook had been the keynote speaker at the Harbor Light Police Foundation Gala at 9:10 p.m. that very night. His speech theme, printed in the event program, was "Public Trust Begins With Us." Denise handed me the program copy. I read those 6 words twice. Roman stared at the tabletop. No one in that room needed me to explain the cruelty of that contrast. There are silences that feel empty, and there are silences that feel full enough to crush a person. What settled over Belhaven Municipal Court at 3:36 p.m. that day was the second kind. No whisper, no cough, no shifting paper. Just a whole room holding the same awful truth at once. I took a brief recess before sentencing because I do not rush the part of my work that can mark a human life for years. Some judges know what they will do before the last witness finishes. I never have. I have strong instincts, yes. I know lies when they step into the light. But judgment is not instinct alone. It is duty tied to reason. So I went back to chambers, closed the door, and sat at my desk with my father's letter opener beside the file and the rain finally easing against the window. I reviewed every exhibit, the stills from Westgate, the Instagram story, the phone extraction, the Bay Street lot images, the improper hold, the address search, the blocked voicemail, the recovered evidence receipt. I read my own notes on demeanor because sometimes the human body tells truth or falsehood before the mouth catches up. Roman had not once asked how badly Marisol was hurt, not once. He had asked how he looked, how the process could be minimized, how the court dared to treat him like every other defendant. That mattered. At 4:08 p.m., we returned to the bench for findings and sentence. The room was full again. Word had spread beyond the courthouse. A local reporter sat in the last row with a notebook she barely touched because the room itself felt like a page already writing itself. Roman stood at the defense table now, shoulders still square but drained of the old shine. His Rolex was gone. I do not know when he removed it. Marisol stood too, one hand resting lightly against the table edge, her brace visible at last under the cardigan sleeve. I began the way I always do, with the law first. On the count of leaving the scene of a property damage accident, I found Roman Halbrook guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. On reckless operation, guilty. On criminal damaging, guilty. On obstructing official business by directing unlawful interference with evidence and response, guilty. On intimidation of a crime victim, guilty. Each finding landed softly in the room, one after another, like doors closing in a long hallway. Then I set the file down and spoke without reading. I told Roman that a courtroom is not impressed by imported leather, rank, donor lists, or the false calm of a man who thinks rules are meant for other people. I told him the most dangerous corruption is not always cash in envelopes or drugs in lockers. Sometimes it is a person so praised for authority that he forgets authority was never his property to begin with. It was a loan from the public, and he had spent it on himself. My father's voice was with me then. I could hear it as clearly as if he were in the gallery, tapping ash from the old pipe he quit 3 times and never really quit at all. Rules without heart become weapons. So I said that too in my own way. I said, when a police captain hits a working mother's car, leaves her on wet pavement with her father's medicine in the rain, searches her address, sends men to her street, strips evidence from her vehicle, and then tells this court it handles barking dogs and parking tickets, the law must answer not only the crash, but the contempt for human equality underneath it. Roman looked at me for the first time that day without any shield in his face. I do not mean he looked sorry. I mean he finally looked mortal. There is a difference, I went on. Ms. Vega did not ask this court for favor. She asked for standing. She asked to be treated as if her labor, her pain, her children, her father, and her fear mattered as much as the comfort of a man used to getting his way. In this courtroom, they do. If you have ever needed to hear that dignity still counts, even when the person across from you has more money, louder friends, and a better suit, then mark this moment with me. Hold on to it. Hit that small sign of agreement in your own heart right now, because too many people in this world are taught to bow before confidence when what they are really seeing is cruelty with good tailoring. Then I imposed sentence. On leaving the scene, 180 days in the Bell County Jail with 60 days to serve and 120 suspended. On reckless operation, 30 days concurrent. On criminal damaging, 90 days concurrent, all suspended. On obstructing official business, 90 days, with 30 days to serve consecutive to the leaving scene count. On intimidation of a crime victim, 180 days, with 90 days to serve consecutive. Total jail sentence imposed, 480 days. Total active time to serve, 180 days. I did not choose that number to make headlines. I chose it because jail had to be real. A fine alone would have been a receipt, not a sentence. Probation alone would have been a scheduling detail. He had used state systems to frighten a citizen and reach into evidence with his own hand. He had done it after a lifetime in law. That is not impulsive foolishness. That is trained contempt. Still, I suspended 300 days because justice without any path back becomes something else, and I was not there to do something else. I ordered Roman to pay restitution in the exact amount of $10,474.83 to Marisol Vega within 30 days. That sum included vehicle repair, towing, rental costs, lost wages from 2 missed shifts, wrist treatment, dash cam replacement, and the hearing aid adjustment fee Daniel missed because the family could not get across town without the car. I ordered 3 years of supervised probation, no contact with Marisol Vega or any member of her family, no use of any law enforcement database except as authorized by a court in future proceedings, though by then I expected his career was already collapsing under its own weight. Then I added the part that made the sentence fit the harm. As a condition of probation following release, Roman Halbrook would complete 320 hours of community service with the Bellhaven Medical Transit Assistance Program, the city service that transports dialysis patients, elderly residents, and low-income families to medical appointments, not in uniform, not in command, not behind tinted glass. He would load wheelchairs, carry bags, wait through delays, and learn what time feels like when you do not control it. He would perform that service under direct supervision, with no media access, no self-promotion, and no substitution by donation. Calvin Sloan objected to the specific placement. I overruled him. The condition was lawful, connected to the offense, and tailored to the damage done. Roman had treated medicine like spilled trash and hardship like background scenery. If he wanted to re-enter the world under suspended time, he could do it by serving the exact people he had taught himself not to see. That was not revenge. That was education through labor. Courts cannot heal a soul, but they can stop a person from outsourcing the cost of his lessons. I also ordered the clerk to transmit certified copies of the findings and exhibits to Bellhaven Professional Standards, the City Manager's Office, and the Ohio Peace Officer Training Commission. Separate investigations were not mine to decide, but I was not about to let what had been proved in my courtroom vanish into the kind of hallway silence that protects institutions better than citizens. Denise nodded once as she wrote. Leon Pike stood straighter. Even the reporter in the back had stopped pretending her hand could keep up. Roman's reaction came in stages. First disbelief, then color draining from his face, then the visible effort to keep his jaw still. He gripped the table edge so hard the tendons stood out over his knuckles. For the first time that day, he looked at Marisol not as a nuisance, not as a target, but as the person whose existence had just altered the shape of his life. He opened his mouth once, then shut it. His lawyer put a hand near his sleeve, but did not touch him. Marisol did not cry. I want to say that clearly because people who have never had their dignity tested often expect tears when justice lands. She closed her eyes for a brief second. That was all. Then she exhaled through her nose and pressed her lips together as if a weight she had been carrying with both hands could at last be set down for a minute. Her daughter Sophia, seated behind her beside Officer Grady, reached forward and touched the back of her mother's chair with just 2 fingers. I asked Roman if he had anything he wished to say before remand. He lifted his head. The anger had not left him, but it had been cut away from certainty. "You're ruining a career over a dented car," he said. I told him, "No, Captain. You ruined a career because you believed a dented car and a frightened family did not matter." Then I nodded to Leon. The bailiff stepped forward. The soft click of the handcuffs sounded smaller than I expected, which somehow made it worse. The room emptied slowly after that. Reporters drifted out first, then the curious public, then counsel, gathering their papers with the hollow motions people use when the fight is over and the meaning has started to settle in. Denise brought me the signed commitment forms. I reviewed them line by line. When I finally looked up, Marisol was still there by counsel table, alone now except for Sophia waiting near the door with Officer Grady. I stepped down from the bench because some moments do not belong, shouted from 7 feet above another person's grief. Marisol stood straighter when I approached, though I could see how tired she was in the skin around her eyes. Up close, she smelled faintly of hospital soap and rain dried on wool. She said very softly, "Thank you for hearing me." I shook my head. "No, Ms. Vega," I said. "Thank you for staying." Her mouth trembled once, barely. Then she nodded. Sophia came over then, 14 years old and trying very hard to stand like a grown woman. She had her mother's eyes and a school backpack still on one shoulder. "My brother thought nobody would believe us," she said. I told her, "Tell your brother the truth does not always move fast, but when it does move, it remembers where to go." It was the kind of sentence people sometimes write down later. In that moment, it was simply the truest thing I had. If you want to know what came next, stay with me a little longer because sentences are not endings. They are doors. Some open into change, some open into more pain. The hardest part of judging is that you rarely know which one you unlocked until months later. Time passed the way it always does after a hard case, not all at once, one docket at a time. Snow turned to sleet. Sleet turned to the tired gray rain of late February. On 3rd March 2026, Roman Halbrook appeared before me by video for a compliance review from Bell County Jail intake. Without the tailored suit and polished shoes, he looked smaller, human in the plainest sense. He answered, "Yes, Your Honor," "No, Your Honor," and nothing more. His counsel informed the court he had resigned from Bellhaven Police on 29th of January. On 17th February, the Ohio Commission had suspended his peace officer certification pending final revocation proceedings. Marisol paid down her title loan with the first restitution installment, and by April used the remainder in a small credit union loan to buy a dark blue 2014 Toyota RAV4 with 96,000 miles on it. Denise showed me the thank you note when it arrived because clerks know which pieces of paper matter more than orders. Marisol's note was written on lined notebook paper, folded clean in thirds. She said the new car started every morning, which felt to her like a kind of mercy. She said Daniel made it to his hearing aid adjustment on 22nd February. She said Raphael had not missed dialysis since. Then on Thursday, 28th of May 2026, I received the letter that told me the sentence had traveled farther than I knew. It came in a plain white envelope with blocky handwriting on the front. Inside was a 2-page note from Daniel Vega, age 10 now, printed carefully in blue pencil. He wrote that he had gone with his mother to pick up his grandfather from Bellhaven Medical Transit on 19th of May. A volunteer in a yellow county vest had carried Raphael's folded wheelchair ramp bag from the curb to the van. The volunteer kept his head down. Daniel recognized him anyway. It was Roman Halbrook. A month later, on Monday, 29th June 2026, Roman appeared in person for probation review. The summer heat had soaked the courthouse brick all morning. He walked in wearing plain khakis, a white county polo, and cheap black shoes with worn heels. No watch, no designer belt, no audience. He stood straighter than some defendants do, but the old performance was gone. Probation reported he had completed 96 of the 320 service hours without incident. No media contact, no violations. He had been assigned mostly to morning medical routes and dialysis transport. When I asked if he had anything to say, he did not give me a speech. He looked at the floor once, then lifted his eyes and said, "I was wrong about what mattered." That was all. It was not a grand apology. It did not restore Marisol's lost sleep or erase Sophia's fear at the curtain or give Daniel back the days when adults in uniform seemed dangerous. But it was the first honest sentence I had heard from him. Sometimes honesty enters late. Late is not ideal. Late is still better than never. Marisol came to that hearing too, though she had no duty to attend. She sat in the second row in a light green blouse and looked less tired than she had in January. Her wrist brace was gone. Afterward, in the hallway, she told Denise that Sophia had decided she wanted to study nursing because somebody has to stay calm when people come in broken. Raphael had started bringing small candy mints for the transit drivers, one for each trip, because gratitude was how he kept his pride from turning hard. These are the details that never make headlines and matter more than half the things that do. We owe one another more than nonviolence. We owe one another dignity. We owe strangers the decency of seeing them as fully real, even when their lives are smaller, poorer, slower, or less guarded than ours. The moment we stop seeing each other that way, the rules turn mean, and the strong begin to treat the weak as scenery. That is when courts matter most, not when things are easy. When they are not, no one is untouchable.